Arthur Penhaligon felt the anniversary in the air before he saw the date on the calendar. It was a specific chill that had nothing to do with the late October weather, a quiet that settled over the town of Oakhaven like a layer of fine, gray dust. 3 years. It felt both like a lifetime and a single, long, sleepless night since Maya and Chloe Peterson had vanished. They had walked out of their front door on Halloween night, 2 small figures in vibrant costumes, a shimmering astronaut and a fluffy yellow chick, and had simply dissolved into the twilight. His bookshop, the Gilded Page, was usually a refuge from the world's sharper edges, a place of hushed reverence where the scent of old paper and leather binding promised stories with clear beginnings, middles, and endings. But on this day, the silence inside felt different. It was not peaceful. It was hollow. Arthur ran a cloth over a row of leather-bound classics, his movements slow and automatic. He remembered the girls. Of course he did. Everyone in Oakhaven remembered them, but for Arthur, the memory was tactile. They had been regulars, 2 bright sparks who would sit in the children's corner, Maya reading voraciously while 7-year-old Chloe would carefully turn the pages of picture books, her small finger tracing the words she was just beginning to master. He paused, the dust cloth still in his hand, and looked toward the small, sunlit alcove where they used to sit. He could almost see the ghost of Maya's dark, serious ponytail and the flash of Chloe's sunny, mischievous grin. The town had mourned collectively, a great wave of shock and grief that had slowly receded, leaving behind a permanent, ugly watermark of fear on the community's soul. Searches had yielded nothing. The police investigation, led by a weary and increasingly grim Detective Miller, had turned up no credible leads. Theories had flown like autumn leaves in a storm. A stranger passing through, a family dispute, a tragic accident in the dense woods surrounding the town, but they were all just whispers against a wall of impenetrable silence. A box of donated books sat by the counter, dropped off a week ago by a family who had moved away. Arthur had been putting off sorting through it. It felt like a chore, another task in a day that already felt heavy with routine. With a sigh, he lifted the box onto the counter. It was a motley collection, worn paperbacks, a few cookbooks, and a stack of children's chapter books. He picked up one, a fantasy novel with a dragon on the cover. He remembered Maya reading it, her brow furrowed in concentration. He fanned the pages, a habit from years of checking for damage or forgotten bookmarks. Something small and crinkly was wedged deep in the binding, near the spine. He worked it loose with his fingertip. It was a candy wrapper, not a common American brand, but something foreign with sharp, unfamiliar lettering and the image of a cartoon bear wearing lederhosen. The brand was Baronzucker, the flavor Kirschcherry. The plastic was slightly faded but still crisp, preserved within the dry pages of the book. He stared at it, a strange sense of dislocation washing over him. It was just a piece of trash, a forgotten remnant of a child's snack. But it felt like more. It was an object out of place, an anomaly. He had never seen this candy before. The girls loved sweets, he knew that. Their father used to joke about their formidable sweet tooth. But this was specific, obscure. Where would a 10-year-old in Oakhaven get a German candy like this? He smoothed the wrapper flat on the counter, the little cartoon bear staring up at him with a vacant, cheerful smile. For the first time in 3 years, the solid wall of the past seemed to have developed a tiny, almost invisible crack. Arthur found he could not throw the wrapper away. He tucked it into the pocket of his waistcoat, where it made a faint crinkling sound whenever he moved, a tiny, persistent reminder. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Customers came and went, their faces etched with the same quiet melancholy that he felt. The anniversary was an unspoken weight shared by all. By closing time, the sky was a bruised purple, and the streetlights cast long, lonely shadows on the pavement. Back in the small apartment above his shop, Arthur sat at his kitchen table, the wrapper laid out before him like a piece of critical evidence. His mind, so accustomed to the linear progression of narrative arcs, began to churn. A story had an internal logic. Every element had to belong. This candy wrapper did not belong to the official story of the Peterson girls' disappearance. It was an errant detail, a loose thread, and he found himself possessed by a quiet, consuming need to pull on it. He turned on his laptop, the screen's glow pushing back the evening gloom. A quick search for Baronzucker Kirsch confirmed his suspicion. It was a German confection, not widely exported. A few specialty importers in major cities carried it, but it was not something you could find at the local Oak Haven grocery store. He scrolled through lists of online retailers, his heart beating a little faster. This was not a random candy bar picked up at a checkout counter. Acquiring it would have required a deliberate act. His thoughts drifted back to the girls. Maya had been the responsible one, always looking out for her younger sister. Chloe was a whirlwind of energy. Their parents, David and Sarah, had been devastated, a hollowed-out couple who had moved away a year after the disappearance, unable to bear the constant, silent reminders that haunted every corner of the town. The police had interviewed everyone. Friends, neighbors, teachers. No one had seen anything. Arthur's suspicion was not a sudden lightning strike, but a slow-dawning dread. The wrapper was a link to someone. Someone who had given the girls this specific, unusual treat. Someone who was close enough to them for one of them to tuck it into a favorite book. It was not the act of a passing stranger. A stranger offered common candy, familiar brands. This felt personal. Felt like grooming. The thought landed in his stomach like a cold stone. The next morning, he called his sister, Eleanor. She was a practical woman, a nurse whose life was governed by charts and data and tangible symptoms. He told her about the book, the wrapper, the German candy. He heard her sigh over the phone, a sound of profound and weary patience he knew all too well. "Arthur," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "It's a piece of garbage. Could have been in that book for years. The family who donated it might have had relatives in Germany. It means nothing. But it was Maya's book. I'm almost certain of it," he insisted, his voice quieter than he intended. "I remember the cover. And why would she have it? It just feels wrong." "Everything about that case feels wrong," Eleanor countered. "That's because it was a tragedy. Please, Arthur, don't do this to yourself. Don't start chasing shadows. It's been 3 years. Let it be. Let them rest." He knew she was right from a logical standpoint. Her words were a dose of sensible, bitter medicine. The odds of this wrapper meaning anything were infinitesimal. Pursuing it was almost certainly a path to obsession and heartache, reopening wounds for himself and potentially for others. He felt a familiar wave of self-doubt. He was a bookseller, not a detective. He dealt in fiction, not in the grim, intractable facts of a cold case. He promised Eleanor he would drop it, and he meant it at that moment. He finished the call and stood in the quiet of his shop, the morning light filtering through the large front window. He tried to focus on his tasks, cataloging new arrivals, balancing the accounts. But his gaze kept drifting to his waistcoat, hanging on the back of a chair. The crinkle of the wrapper was a whisper he could not ignore. Eleanor's logic was sound, but his intuition, a faculty he trusted as much as his own eyes, screamed that he was wrong to let it go. The image of Maya's serious face and Chloe's bright smile returned to him, not as ghosts of a sad memory, but as a silent, urgent plea. He was the one who had found the wrapper. Maybe, just maybe, that meant he was the one who was supposed to do something about it. The internal debate raged for 2 days. Arthur felt as if he were two different people. The sensible shopkeeper who agreed with his sister, and a more restless, insistent man he barely recognized. He would put the wrapper in a drawer, determined to forget it, only to retrieve it hours later, smoothing it out on his palm. The cartoon bear's cheerful face had begun to look sinister. It was the dissonance that got to him, the happy, childish packaging and the dark, silent mystery it was now a part of. Finally, on the 3rd day, the restless man won. He closed the shop early, leaving a sign on the door that read, "Closed for personal reasons." He got into his old, reliable sedan and started driving. He had found one of the importers on the list, a German delicatessen called Schmitz, in a city about an hour away. It was a long shot, a fool's errand, but it was an action. It was better than the crushing inertia of doing nothing. The drive felt surreal. The highway stretched out before him, a ribbon of gray asphalt under a gray sky. He was acting on a hunch, a feeling. It was the kind of thing protagonists did in the very novels he sold, but in real life it felt foolish and presumptuous. Yet, as he drove, the feeling of purpose solidified. Eleanor was wrong. This was not about chasing shadows. It was about honoring a memory. It was about a duty he felt to the two little girls who had loved his shop. Schmidt's Delicatessen was a small, charming place, tucked away on a side street. The air inside was thick with the smell of cured meats, rye bread, and strong coffee. An elderly man with a kind, wrinkled face and a thick German accent stood behind the counter. Arthur's heart pounded in his chest. This was the moment of truth. He could be dismissed as a lunatic within seconds. He bought a coffee to steady his nerves, then approached the counter again. "Excuse me," he began, his voice surprisingly steady. "I have a strange question for you." He pulled the Baronzucker wrapper from his pocket and laid it on the counter. "Do you sell this brand of candy?" The owner, Mr. Schmidt, peered at it through his spectacles.
Ah, Baron-Zucker.
"Yes, of course. A taste of the old country. Very popular. The children love the little bear." Arthur leaned in slightly. "I was wondering if you remember who buys it. Specifically, if you have any regular customers for it from out of town." "From a place called Oakhaven?" Mr. Schmidt frowned, a thoughtful expression on his face as he wiped the counter with a cloth. "Oakhaven? That is a ways from here. People do not usually drive so far for candy. I have many customers. It is hard to remember faces." He paused, tapping a finger on the counter. "But this candy, there is one man. He does not buy it often, maybe a few times a year, but he buys a whole box. A special order." Arthur's breath caught in his throat. "Do you know his name?" "No, no name. He always pays with cash," Schmidt said, shaking his head. "But I remember him. A quiet fellow. Very polite. He said he was a carpenter, I think. He told me once he comes to the city for special hardware, for restoring old houses. European things, you know? Hinges, locks. He said the candy reminded him of his grandfather. Carpenter. From Oakhaven." The pieces were falling into place with a terrifying speed. "What does he look like?" Arthur asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Oh, an ordinary man. My age, perhaps a little younger," Schmidt said, gesturing to his own graying hair. "Average height. Strong hands like a man who works with wood. Wears simple work clothes. Nothing special about him, really. Just quiet." Arthur thanked the man, his mind reeling. He drove back to Oakhaven in a daze. Carpenter. Quiet. Polite. Average. The description could fit half a dozen men in town. But one name surfaced in his mind with chilling certainty. Frank Coleman. Frank was a fixture in Oakhaven. He was the town's go-to handyman, a master craftsman who could fix anything from a leaky faucet to a collapsing roof. He was known for his meticulous work and his fair prices. He was a solitary man who lived in a small, neat house on the edge of town. A man people described as keeping to himself, but always willing to lend a hand. He was reliable, trustworthy. He had done work for dozens of families, including, Arthur remembered with a jolt, the Petersons. He had built the beautiful new deck on the back of their house the summer before the girls disappeared. The idea was monstrous. Frank Coleman? The man who brought soup to a sick neighbor and fixed the church steeple for free? It seemed impossible. And yet the description fit. The quiet demeanor, the profession, the plausible backstory of a German grandfather. Arthur felt a deep, gut-wrenching certainty that was entirely at odds with the man's public reputation. He had to get closer. He had to know for sure. But how? He couldn't go to the police with this. A candy wrapper and a vague description from a shopkeeper an hour away? Detective Miller would laugh him out of the station. He needed a pretext, a reason to talk to Frank, to observe him up close. He looked around his bookshop, his eyes scanning for an excuse. They landed on a tall, antique bookshelf near the back, one that had always had a slight wobble. It was the perfect excuse. A small, simple job. An opportunity to have Frank Coleman inside his space, where he could watch him, talk to him, and trust the intuition that had brought him this far. It took him another day to build up the courage. Making that phone call felt like crossing a line, a point of no return. He was no longer just a curious citizen. He was actively engineering a confrontation with a man he suspected of an unspeakable crime. His hand trembled as he dialed the number. Frank's voice on the phone was exactly as Arthur expected. Calm, level, and professional. Coleman Carpentry. "Hello, Mr. Coleman," Arthur said, trying to keep his own voice even. "This is Arthur Penhaligon from the Gilded Page. I have a bookshelf that needs securing, and I was told you were the best man for the job." "I can certainly take a look," Frank said. "I can stop by tomorrow afternoon, if that works for you." They arranged a time. After hanging up, Arthur leaned against the counter, his heart hammering against his ribs. The trap, if one could call it that, was set, and he had to walk into it alongside his quarry. Frank Coleman arrived precisely on time the next day. He was just as Mr. Schmidt had described him. A man of about 60 with graying hair, a quiet face, and the large, capable hands of a craftsman. He wore simple denim overalls and carried a well-worn wooden toolbox. His presence was utterly unassuming. He smiled politely at Arthur, a small, reserved smile that did not quite reach his pale blue eyes. "Mr. Penhaligon," he said with a nod. "Show me the problem." Arthur led him to the back of the shop, his own movements feeling stiff and rehearsed. He pointed to the wobbly bookshelf. "It's this one. It's an old piece, and I don't want it to tip over on a customer." Frank examined it with professional detachment, running his hand along the wood, testing the joints. "Simple fix," he pronounced. "Just needs to be braced and anchored to the wall. Won't take long." He set to work with a quiet efficiency that was almost hypnotic. Arthur hovered nearby, pretending to sort books, his senses on high alert. He was watching Frank's every move, his every expression, searching for a crack in the placid facade. There was none. The man was a study in calm competence. As Frank worked, Arthur tried to steer the conversation. He started with small talk about the town, about the changing seasons. Frank's answers were short, polite, and non-committal. Then Arthur took a breath and made his move. He had gone back to Schmidt's that morning and bought a bag of the Baronzucker candies. "Would you care for a candy?" Arthur asked, holding out the bag. "I found them at a German deli in the city. They're quite unusual." He watched Frank's face with an intensity that felt like it could burn holes. For a fraction of a second, just a flicker, something changed in Frank's eyes. A momentary stillness, a sharpening of focus that was gone as quickly as it appeared. Then he smiled that same small, reserved smile. "No, thank you," he said, turning back to his work. "I should not. Too much sugar." It was a simple refusal, perfectly normal. But Arthur had seen that flicker. He decided to press gently. "A friend told me they were a taste of the old country. Made me think of my own grandparents." Frank paused in his drilling. He looked at Arthur, his expression unreadable. "My grandfather was from Germany," he said, his voice flat. "He used to give me sweets like this when I was a boy." The lie was delivered perfectly. It was the exact story he had told Mr. Schmidt. It was plausible, sentimental, and completely disarming. Another man would have been reassured. Arthur felt a profound chill spread through his chest. The facade was flawless. Too flawless. A real memory would have come with a different emotion. Nostalgia, sadness, warmth. Frank's delivery had the hollow ring of a well-rehearsed script. "It's a shame kids today don't have those same simple pleasures," Arthur said, his voice laced with a melancholy he did not have to feign. "I think about the Peterson girls sometimes. They loved this shop. They loved their sweets." He watched Frank's reaction to the name. The man's hands did not still. His expression did not change. He simply nodded slowly. "A terrible tragedy," he said, his voice a low monotone. "A terrible thing for this town." He then turned his full attention back to the bookshelf, inserting a screw with a steady hand. The conversation was over. Frank finished the job, cleaned up his workspace meticulously, and handed Arthur a modest bill. He was polite, professional, and utterly impenetrable. As Arthur watched him walk out of the shop and down the street, he was left with two conflicting certainties. First, he had absolutely no concrete evidence of anything. Second, he was more convinced than ever that Frank Coleman was hiding a monstrous secret. The man's calm was not the calm of innocence. It was the calm of absolute control. The confrontation had been a failure in terms of gathering proof, but it had hardened Arthur's resolve. The man was a liar. The story about his grandfather, delivered with such cold precision, was the confirmation his intuition needed. But intuition was not evidence. He couldn't go to Detective Miller with a feeling. He needed more. He began to watch Frank Coleman. It felt like a violation, a descent into a kind of paranoid madness, but he could not stop himself. He would park his car down the street from Frank's small house in the early mornings, watching the man emerge and drive off in his work truck. He followed him, always keeping a safe distance, his heart in his throat every time Frank's truck slowed or turned. For a week, the surveillance yielded nothing. Frank went to jobs, to the hardware store, to the grocery. He lived the life of a quiet, hard-working carpenter. Arthur began to feel the heavy weight of Eleanor's warnings, the creeping fear that he was losing his grip, chasing a phantom born of his own grief. He was on the verge of giving up, of surrendering to the crushing probability that he was wrong, when something changed. It was a Saturday afternoon. Arthur was parked at his usual vantage point when Frank came out of his house. Instead of getting into his work truck, he got into an old, nondescript blue sedan that Arthur had never seen him drive before. And instead of heading toward the center of town, he drove out toward the old logging roads, in the opposite direction of his known jobs. Arthur's pulse quickened. He followed, his own car feeling conspicuous on the sparsely populated country roads. Frank drove for 20 minutes, winding his way deeper into the forested outskirts of Oakhaven, finally turning onto a long, overgrown gravel driveway. At the end of it, barely visible through a stand of skeletal autumn trees, was an old, dilapidated farmhouse. It had been vacant for at least a decade, a place local kids told ghost stories about. Arthur parked his car on the shoulder of the main road, his view partially obscured by the trees. He watched as Frank got out of the sedan. He was not carrying a toolbox. He was carrying 2 large bags of groceries. Frank unlocked the front door of the supposedly abandoned farmhouse, glanced around once, and then disappeared inside. Arthur sat in his car, his mind struggling to process what he had just seen. Why would Frank Coleman be taking groceries into a derelict building? The house had no running water, no electricity, as far as anyone knew, unless he had restored it in secret, unless someone was living there. This was it. This was the piece of concrete evidence he needed, the tangible proof of deception that went far beyond a candy wrapper or a suspicious story. This was something he could take to the police. He drove back to town, his hands shaking on the steering wheel. He was no longer dealing with a hunch. He was dealing with a secret location, a hidden life. And the groceries. The groceries suggested he was not alone in that house. He went straight to the Oakhaven police station. The building was small and smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. The officer at the front desk regarded him with bored indifference until he said he needed to speak with Detective Miller about the Peterson case. That got him a raised eyebrow and a long, skeptical look, but the officer eventually picked up the phone. Detective Miller looked older than Arthur remembered, his face more deeply lined, his shoulders stooped with a permanent weariness. He led Arthur into a small, cluttered office and sat down behind a metal desk, gesturing for Arthur to take the chair opposite. "Mr. Penhaligon," Miller began, his tone flat and devoid of curiosity. "The desk sergeant said something about the Peterson case. It's been a cold case for over 2 years. What's this about?" Arthur took a deep breath and laid it all out. He started with the book and the candy wrapper. He saw Miller's expression tighten with impatience. He told him about the trip to Schmidt's Deli and the carpenter's story. Miller's face was a mask of professional skepticism. But when Arthur described following Frank Coleman, the second car, the abandoned farmhouse, and the bags of groceries, He saw a flicker of interest in the detective's tired eyes. "So, a handyman is visiting a property," Miller said, leaning back in his chair, the skepticism returning. "Maybe he's restoring it for the owner. Maybe he uses it for storage. Taking groceries there is odd, I'll grant you, but it's not a crime." "He lied about the candy," Arthur insisted, his voice rising with desperation. "He has a secret car. He is going to a secret house. None of this is normal behavior. You searched his home and his truck 3 years ago, right? You found nothing. But you didn't know about this house." "There are 100 innocent explanations for this, Arthur," Miller said, his voice softening slightly, as if speaking to a distraught child. "I can't get a warrant to search a property based on a man buying groceries. You need to understand that." "He took 2 bags," Arthur said, leaning forward, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. "Large bags, and I saw what was in the top of one of them. It was a box of children's cereal. One of those brightly colored ones with a cartoon character on the front. And a package of juice boxes." That was the detail that finally broke through Miller's professional reserve. The detective's eyes narrowed. The idea of children's food being taken into a derelict house by a man who officially lived alone was a glaring red flag that no amount of procedure could cover. It spoke of a present and ongoing situation. Created a sense of urgency. "A welfare check," Miller said, almost to himself. "The property is listed as abandoned. Reports of a trespasser, concerns about a potential squatter, maybe an endangered runaway. I could justify a welfare check." He looked at Arthur, his gaze sharp and serious now. "You're sure about what you saw? The cereal?" "I am absolutely certain," Arthur said, his voice firm. Miller was silent for a long moment, his fingers drumming a restless rhythm on the desk. He looked from Arthur to the cold case file for the Peterson girls, which Arthur could see on a shelf behind him, thick and dusty. Finally, he nodded slowly. "All right, Mr. Penhaligon. We'll go have a look. You stay here." "No," Arthur said, standing up. "I'm not getting in your way, but I have to be there. I'll wait down the road." "Please, detective." Miller studied him for a moment, then gave a reluctant sigh. "Fine. But you stay in your vehicle. Do not approach the house. Is that clear?" It was clear. An hour later, Arthur was back on the country road, parked in the same spot, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He watched as 2 police cruisers, lights off, pulled quietly into the overgrown driveway. Detective Miller and another, younger officer got out and walked toward the farmhouse. The sun was beginning to set, casting the whole scene in a surreal orange glow. From his vantage point, Arthur could see Miller knock on the door. After a moment, it opened and Frank Coleman stood there. Even from a distance, Arthur could see the man's posture. He was not surprised or scared. He looked annoyed, like a man interrupted during a quiet evening. He and Miller spoke for a few minutes. Frank gestured dismissively. Miller was insistent. Finally, Frank stepped aside, and the 2 officers entered the house. The wait was agonizing. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Arthur gripped his steering wheel, his knuckles white. What were they finding inside? Was it all a mistake? Was he about to be proven a paranoid fool? He imagined the officers walking through empty, dusty rooms, finding nothing but old furniture and cobwebs, while Frank stood by with a look of smug vindication. Then the front door of the farmhouse burst open. It was the younger officer. He ran back to his cruiser, spoke urgently into his radio, and then pulled out a heavy-duty crowbar from his trunk. He ran back inside. Arthur's blood ran cold. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. He could not stay in the car. Ignoring Miller's order, he got out and crept closer, using the trees for cover until he was at the edge of the clearing. He could hear sounds from inside the house now, shouting, and a loud, splintering crack of wood. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise. After what felt like a lifetime, Detective Miller emerged from the house. He was not alone. He was supporting a figure, a girl so thin and pale she looked like a phantom in the fading light. She was tall, her dark hair long and unkempt. She stumbled as she walked, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it seemed to have scoured her clean of all other emotion. It was Maya. She was alive. Arthur felt his knees go weak, and he leaned against a tree for support, a sob catching in his throat. She was alive. After 3 years, she was alive. The younger officer came out next, his arm firmly around Frank Coleman. The handyman's face was a blank mask. There was no rage, no denial, no fear. He looked calm, resigned, his pale blue eyes empty. As they led him to the cruiser, his gaze swept over the yard and, for a moment, it met Arthur's. And in that moment, Arthur saw a flicker of something in those dead eyes. It was not remorse. It was something like satisfaction, a chilling, proprietary pride. The full horror had not yet revealed itself. As medics arrived and gently guided Maya toward an ambulance, a terrible question hung in the air, unspoken but screaming in Arthur's mind. Where was Chloe? Detective Miller walked over to him, his face ashen. "You were right, Arthur," he said, his voice raspy. "God help us, you were right." "Chloe," Arthur whispered. "Where is Chloe?" Miller's face crumpled. "She's not in there," he said heavily. According to Maya, Frank wasn't alone in this. There were others. Chloe, she was taken away by another man a few weeks ago. The relief Arthur had felt at seeing Maya was instantly consumed by a new, more complex wave of horror. This was not a simple kidnapping. This was not one disturbed man holding 2 children in a basement. The cellar they had breached had been soundproofed, a grimly furnished prison cell. But Frank was just one piece of it. It was a network, an organized, depraved system of trafficking, hidden beneath the placid surface of their quiet little town, orchestrated in part by the helpful, reliable town carpenter. The candy wrapper had not just been a clue to a kidnapping. It had been the key to unlocking a far deeper and more sickening layer of hell. The hours that followed were a chaotic blur of flashing lights, crackling radios, and grim-faced officials. The farmhouse was sealed off as a major crime scene. Arthur was taken to the police station, not as a suspect, but as the primary witness. He sat in the same small office where he had pleaded with Detective Miller, giving a formal statement, his voice a monotone as he recounted the series of events that had started with a piece of trash in a book. He felt detached, as if he were watching a film of someone else's life. He saw Maya being led into a private room with a female officer and a trauma specialist. She was wrapped in a thick blanket, her movements small and fearful, like a wild creature and used to the light. The sight of her, so fragile and yet so resilient, was both heartbreaking and awe-inspiring. She had survived 3 years in that cellar. Detective Miller eventually came back into the office and slumped into his chair. He looked like he had aged a decade in the last few hours. "He's talking," Miller said, rubbing his face with his hands. "Frank Coleman. He's not confessing in a legal sense, not yet. He's explaining. Is sick. He has this twisted justification for everything. He saw himself as their caretaker. He said he was protecting them from the outside world, the other men. He calls them associates. He's giving up names, locations. He kept meticulous records. The cold, businesslike nature of the evil was almost more horrifying than a crime of passion would have been. Frank was not a monster who had lost control. He was a methodical, patient predator who had built a respectable life as his camouflage. The Baronzucker candy was part of his method. A small, exclusive treat to build trust. A symbol of his role as the kind captor in their terrifying world. Over the next 48 hours, the full, nightmarish scope of Frank Coleman's operation came to light. He and his associates had targeted vulnerable children for years, using a network of hidden locations and false identities. His job as a carpenter gave him access to homes, allowed him to identify potential victims, and provided the perfect cover for acquiring and modifying remote properties like the farmhouse. And then, the news came that felt like the sun breaking through the darkest storm clouds. Based on the information from Frank's ledgers, federal agents raided a property in a neighboring state. They found Chloe. She was alive, traumatized and terrified, but alive. When Arthur heard the news, The emotional dam he had built inside himself finally broke. He sat in his quiet bookshop, the place where it had all started, and wept. He wept for the years the girls had lost, for the horror they had endured, for the shattering of his town's innocence. But he also wept with a profound, bone-deep relief. They were found. The search was over. The aftermath was a long, slow process of coming to terms with the unthinkable. Oakhaven was no longer the town it had been. Every familiar face was now tinged with a new suspicion. Every quiet corner a potential hiding place for secrets. Frank Coleman was not just a monster. He was a monster they had all known, liked, and trusted. That betrayal was a poison that seeped into the community's roots. Arthur became an reluctant local hero. People would stop him on the street, shake his hand. Their eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and horror. They called him brave, persistent. But he did not feel brave. He felt weary and profoundly sad. He had not been driven by courage, but by a quiet, nagging duty to the memory of two little girls. He had simply refused to look away from something that felt wrong. Justice moved forward. Frank Coleman and his network were dismantled. Their crimes laid bare in a trial that shocked the nation. The legal proceedings provided a sense of factual closure, a confirmation that the perpetrators were caught and would be punished. But Arthur knew, as did everyone in Oakhaven, that this was not a story with a simple, happy ending. The resolution was not a cure. He knew that the trauma Maya and Chloe had endured would be a part of their lives forever. Their rescue was not the end of their ordeal, but the beginning of a new, long, and difficult journey toward healing. The scars they carried were invisible but permanent. The world could never be a completely safe place for them again. Months later, as life in Oakhaven settled into a new, more somber normal, Arthur was working in his shop one quiet afternoon. The bell over the door chimed, and he looked up. A woman he recognized as a child psychologist stood there, and beside her, holding her hand, was Maya. She was still thin, still pale, but her eyes were different. The raw, primal terror was gone, replaced by a deep, watchful quiet. She looked at Arthur, a flicker of recognition in her gaze. She was holding a piece of drawing paper. Without a word, she walked forward and held it out to him. Arthur took it gently. It was a child's drawing, rendered in bright, hopeful crayons. It was a picture of his bookshop, The Gilded Page. Over the roof, Maya had drawn a large, yellow sun with rays stretching out to touch every corner of the paper. Arthur looked from the drawing to the girl's serious face. He could not speak. He simply nodded, a lump forming in his throat. It was a thank you. It was a sign of hope. It was a small, fragile, beautiful thing that had grown in the dark. Maya gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile before allowing the psychologist to lead her back out of the shop. Arthur stood there for a long time, holding the drawing in his hands. He was just a bookseller, a man of quiet routines and fictional worlds. But he had pulled on a thread of impossibility and unraveled a nightmare. He had not fixed the world, but he had helped to save two small parts of it. And in the profound silence of his shop, surrounded by a million other stories, he finally understood that this one, the truest and most terrible he had ever been a part of, had found its painful, hopeful, and unending conclusion.